Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today. As a proud Kungarrakan, Iwaja and Woolwonga man, I'd like to recognise all of the country that we're all on and pay our respects to elders past and present, and also to recognise our youth who are going to be our future leaders, the custodians of our stories, our cultures, our histories and our languages. And it's so important that we do listen to our youth because, as I said, they are our future. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people. My name is Tom Kelmer, and I'm the patron of Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit Australia. I'm here to welcome you to Gayaa Dhuwi's first webinar for 2024, The Voice, Where to From Here. Today we'll hear from 4 esteemed experts and community leaders, Professor Pat Dudgeon, Dr. Clinton Shultz, Thomas Mayo, and Tanja Hirvonen. They will share their thoughts and insights into the new post-referendum landscape for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and they'll discuss how we can continue to support and foster good social and emotional well-being within ourselves and our communities. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Pat Dudgeon. Over to you, Pat.
Hello everyone, my name's Pat Dudgeon. I'm a professor with the University of Western Australia. I have many roles. One of my big roles is I'm the director of the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention. I'm also the lead chief investigator of the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing grant, and I wear a number of other hats. One of them, a very important hat, is that I'm a board director for Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit Australia, a very important peak organisation that's concerned with Indigenous mental health and wellbeing, suicide prevention and social and emotional wellbeing. So I live and work in beautiful Noongar, that's in Perth in Western Australia, but my people are from the Kimberley, so I'm from the Bardi people of the Kimberley. So as we moved towards the referendum, I think everyone was quite optimistic that we saw that the having a voice in Parliament was a very important step forward, that it meant that we would be recognised as First Nations people in our own right, that there would be a vehicle or a body that looked after our interests specifically and was dedicated to Indigenous or First Nations people and their issues. I think what excited us too was that this was an elected body. So I know there was a lot of misinformation during the process of the referendum, but that ultimately this would be an elected body by the people to represent our interests broadly and all across the nation. So it was a very, it had such great potential. And given the misinformation that was doing the rounds as we led up to the referendum, we noticed immediately there was an increase of racism. So on our, we always get a bit of racism no matter what we do. We've seen that on our posts about suicide prevention, and social emotional well-being on social media. You'll always get someone say something negative, and usually we just delete and block those people. However, it became really pronounced as we moved towards the referendum. There was a lot more racism, fear, cries of, there's a group of people that are getting special treatment, and not seeing that there needed to be a progressive steps put in place to lift First Nations people out of disadvantage, poverty and silence, so that we would have our own body. I know some people said, well, there's lots of Indigenous ministers in Parliament, shouldn't that be enough? But they have other portfolios too. Obviously, they do have a a commitment and responsibility to Indigenous issues, but they also have broader portfolios. So the Voice would have given us an opportunity to have our own people represent us specifically on First Nations issues. So there was no threats to it. It was, the Voice was very misunderstood or deliberately misunderstood, and that then gave permission, I feel, for more racism to happen. So it was a time of increased racist comments. People were very emotional about it, and it was very difficult to be Indigenous in that period of time, and now still is, because after the referendum failed, the racism has not gone away, it has stayed. And in fact, perhaps the failure of the referendum validates those racist people who were making racist comments on social media. So I think that it's been a bit of a step backwards in some respects, but not all. When the referendum, we knew it was going to fail, it was a big blow to us, and I remember feeling very distraught when we knew for sure that it had failed. And it not only had failed, but it had failed so very profoundly and in areas which we expected more of. So there was a great disappointment and grief for us. I think myself and some of my colleagues, my Indigenous colleagues, we thought, well, we've been through hard times, we'll be able to weather this, but we weren't. It has had an impact on us, on all of us, and I think we have not recovered from that. But when it did happen, firstly, I thought about our youth. I was very concerned with our youth, that basically the country had voted not to recognise them. So that is a profound thing to say to a young Indigenous person. I was also very worried about our allies who stood and worked so hard for the referendum, and the great disappointment and grief they would feel. So I was more concerned with others initially, and I thought myself and other older colleagues would weather it much better. But it has changed us, and I speak to colleagues now, and it was a profound blow. It was a very profound blow. All our lives we've worked for reconciliation. We work towards a united Australia with Indigenous people recognised as the first peoples of this country, and then to have all that hard work dismissed so easily, it was the most weird and alienating feeling, and one of despair. I think a lot of people felt like turning their back on society and not participating. However, we are recovering and we are coming out of that. A lot of people blacked out their social media in the first week following the failed referendum, and rightly so, because it was a period of grieving, of recuperation, of what does it mean for us. And as I said earlier, it's not a direct, it happened, now we'll recover. It has left its mark, and it's left its mark in our youth as well, and in our allies. So I think now that things have settled a little bit, I think that the way forward is to remember, and I know when people said that immediately afterwards, it was very cold comfort, but the 40% who did vote yes, they're the important people. And we know that 40% support Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous recognition, despite all the misinformation, which there was a lot of. So despite all the misinformation and the high emotions that were happening at the time, 40% stand staunchly beside Indigenous or First Nations people. So I think that's the best takeaway message from this referendum. But the seeing racism so very obvious, now seeing some of the repercussions, like some councils apparently are choosing or voting not to have acknowledgement or welcome to countries. That's a step backwards too, but other councils are saying no, that they will stand with keeping their acknowledgements and welcome to countries. Some organisations have become quite political and very as in supporting First Nations rights. So I think there's a bit of a mixed responses that are happening. But overall, I think that I'm seeing positive responses. It has. We can't deny though that the referendum did legitimise or validate expressions, racist expressions. But going forward, I'm very mindful of the good hard work done by our Indigenous leadership, and the fabulous work done by Minister Linda Burney, of Professor Tom Calma, of Mr. Thomas Mayo, and others. There's probably a lot of others, but the work they did, and the shoulders too that they they climb on. So it's not that that they were the first ones to propose this. There's always been discussions about ensuring that there's some political recognition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we have never got to the point that we did with the referendum. So I'm acknowledging and recognising our historical activists and freedom fighters who had tried in previous times to ensure that we were recognised. But in particular, in this time around, I'm recognising the people I mentioned, and Professor Marcia Langton, who suffered so much racism during this process. So in full recognition of their hard work, the hard work of our allies, and the messages that they have said is after this is stay strong, stay in our cultural rights. We do belong to the oldest living culture on earth, and we need to hang on to that, and there's no turning that back. We've been through a process of terrible colonisation that led to disempowerment, displacement, people removed from their countries, children stolen from their families, and so on. We know that there's still systemic racism that is in society. Our high numbers in the justice system, our high numbers of suicides attest to this. But we know too that the way forward is for us to be strong in our culture, for us to be strong in our community and family, and for us to have self-determination. So while it would have been good to have the voice, we can still ensure that self-determination happens in all our organisations, that government departments ensure that they enact self-determination, so that any matters about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander decision-making mechanisms in place. And that's our way forward, is that first of all, to ensure that self-determination takes place at every different level, but secondly also that some of our solutions will be ones that go back to cultural values and aspirations. So we in Australia, I feel, are in a process of recovery and healing from colonisation. Where we're going is a place where we will be a part of this country, but there will be acknowledgement and recognition and value given to Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander values and aspirations, some of which will be different to mainstream. And mainstream is more than welcome to join into some of these activities, programs, services, but for Aboriginal people, any program, initiative, policy needs to be led by the people themselves. They need to make the decisions on it and to ensure that it's also culturally appropriate. So I think if we want to drill down a little bit more into that, I think that mental health and wellbeing has been neglected in the provision of services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I really like and I'm optimistic about the national agreement in First Nation health and wellbeing. I'm really optimistic that Gayaa Dhuwi is responsible for the social emotional wellbeing policy partnership, where the target is zero suicide, but the aim is to have increased social emotional well-being. Part of the issues there, the aspirations there, is that Aboriginal people again need to be in charge of their own affairs, but I think that mental health is one of those areas where we do need very much our own people and experts advising on what needs to happen in that area, that there needs to be full Indigenous engagement and decision making, and right across the system, whether it's in decision making, policy or service delivery. In particular, there's an important role that the Aboriginal community controlled health organisations play, and it's important that they've embraced programs such as Culture Care Connect, or developed them. So they're becoming in as a big player for our communities to ensure that suicide prevention initiatives and wellbeing initiatives are well looked after. So I think that I'd like to see more resources going to Indigenous organisations and programs, so they can directly connect with local communities to determine what they feel needs to be done, where the gaps are, and to work together to fill them. That's something that no one else can do. We do need our own Indigenous people to do that. And then we need to have leadership at all levels to ensure that policy matches the needs of the people and fills the gaps. But just in parting, I think that a lot of work needs to be done after the referendum. I think there's a whole lot of activities that are happening across the nation. Certainly we're doing our bit at UWA, but it is about the youth. Our concerns are about the youth. After this so very public and profound rejection, we're fearful that there might be an increase in suicide, that there might be an increase in feelings of alienation and not being a part of mainstream society, not being welcomed in there. So we need to put more resources into ensuring the well-being of our Aboriginal youth. And there will be activities happening across the country. We certainly are doing our part in it, and I think that needs to be a focus, and our allies too. For any allies that are watching this, your role's important, very important. We can't do this on our own. We need our allies to stand by our side, as they have during the referendum process. We know that we are strong in our culture. The work that we are doing, it's not just for ourselves, it's for our families, our children and our future. So I say together, all our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander colleagues and friends and families and all our allies, we stand strong, and we will go into the future determined that we will continue fighting for social justice. Taking a social emotional wellbeing approach is really important. Most of you know what social emotional wellbeing is from an Indigenous perspective, and that's about the person in connection to not only their mind and their body, but their families, their communities, their culture, their ancestors, their country and their spirituality. So it's a holistic approach to wellness. And it also recognises the impacts of history, that history of colonisation that have led us to this point, the influences of politics that impact on us, and also cultural determinants. So, social and cultural determinants. So it recognises all those other influences beyond a person, a community, a family and a community. But taking a social emotional wellbeing approach works for Aboriginal people because it does acknowledge that, it is about, not just about the individual, but it's about the collective individual with their family, with their community, ancestors and country, but also that we are part of this process of colonisation and in need of recovery and healing. So often Western mental health approaches are very much individual, and they're about your mind, your body, and that's it. It doesn't consider anything else. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, SCWB approach resonates and seems more relevant because it addresses all the issues that are important to us. So taking that approach is becoming very much a prevailing approach, which is fantastic. That's fabulous. Obviously, if you're offering a service in a particular area, you do need to focus on that. But if you have the SCWB approach, it's strength-based in the first instance, but it also, while it focuses on one area, it recognises that there are other factors that are impacting on the individual, family and community as well. Given that it is an Indigenous paradigm, and at the heart of it is that very much we're individuals, but we're collective individuals who are made up of ourselves, our families, communities, and very much we are embedded in a culture and a history.
Yeah, I'm a Gayaa Dhuwi. Dr. Clinton Shultz here. I'm a Gomeroi man, live on Cumbermary country on the Gold Coast. I'm the Director of First Nations Strategy and Partnerships with Black Dog Institute. I just wanted to have a quick yarn today with everybody about how we can move forward in a positive direction, both as individuals but also within organisations post the referendum. I don't think we can escape the fact that there's been an unfortunate fallout post the referendum. I think we have to recognise some of the negatives that have come out of it, but not for the purpose of dwelling on them. I think it's important to recognise some of those concerns, some of those issues that have arisen since the referendum. So collectively, as mob, we can look at what are those barriers, what are those hurdles, and what is it within our opportunities and resources that we can actually do to move forward in a positive direction. So we know that there has been an increase in the incidences of racism being reported by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander post the referendum. Anybody who's been on social media would probably recognise that there has been a lot more overt racism being expressed on different platforms across social media. Unfortunately, many people are on social media, so we are more likely to actually be exposed to those incidences of racism that are occurring. One of the alarming things for me, though, is that we've actually noticed an increase in lateral violence amongst our families, our communities, and within our organisations. Now, lateral violence is that in-group violence that tends to come about when in-group members who are already feeling oppressed become further overwhelmed due to factors of being let down, or it could be due to limited resources, or really not seeing a positive direction to be able to move forward. And I think many people are having those experiences at the moment. So I can understand how the lateral violence has come about, but we do need to be aware of it. We do need to name it. We do need to look at what are our responsibilities within that space to minimise and control its presence. Many mob are feeling rejection, let down, and just completely overwhelmed at the moment. I think it's important that we recognise that no matter where people sat on the referendum debate, that many mob from both sides are feeling negative experiences post the event. We need to show a lot of love, a lot of kindness, and a lot of acceptance for each other in terms to be moving forward. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go through this presentation. These negatives, what has it led to? Well, it's all led to an impact on social emotional well-being at multiple levels. We know there's been impacts on individuals. The impacts that are experienced by individuals tend to have a flow-out impact to those things that they're connected to. So that includes our families, our communities, and our workplaces. All right, so let's have a look at the importance of keeping a positive mindset. Now, I completely get that that can be hard when there's been significant negative events that have occurred, be that at an individual, a family, or a societal level, like what occurred with the referendum. So why do we perceive threats quite often? It's a biological or evolutional development that we've had that has allowed us to survive across the entire period of time. The more likely we were to pick up threat, the more likely we were to be able to protect ourselves or to avoid threat. So it's quite natural that we notice threats in our lives all the time. Now, what has changed over recent years? A few things, actually. So the first thing is that the speed or the pace at which information is produced and shared is far quicker than it ever has been in history. So information is produced and is shared across all sorts of media. And unfortunately, we tend to be exposed to that media, and therefore we're exposed to the threat messages that come through in that media. So if we're looking at TV, for instance, you'll notice that a lot of the content that is produced, be it on the news or even in just regular shows, is very much drama centric, meaning that it's negative a lot of the time. And we're exposed to that. So therefore we become more likely to look out for that and to experience that. Also for us though, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and for many other peoples around the planet, particularly those that have been impacted by colonisation and all the negative things that that has brought, or those groups that have been oppressed over long periods of time, is that we've had to become more attuned to threat, again, as a mechanism for survival. So sometimes people will say things to me like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are too sensitive to racism. Well, what a load of baloney. We're not more sensitive to racism. The actual fact is we are more likely to be exposed and have been over generations, not just in our own lifetime, to racism. So yes, we notice it more than others. One, because it impacts on us and not necessarily the perpetrators. But two, we've had to figure out how do I notice it so that I can best protect myself from being in that situation or similar situations again. So no, we're not too sensitive. We have every right to have the experiences that we have. And unfortunately, those have come through exposure, not through sensitivity. Often though, what happens is when we're exposed to a lot of negativity, or we're very threat-centric or threat-focused, is we lose sight of the positives that always are existing around us and occurring around us. And this often leads to us not being able to hold sight of a more positive direction forward. This all leads to disturbances in our social-emotional well-being, and it makes it more difficult for us to plan how to stabilise or how to maintain or how to better our social and emotional well-being as we move forward. So what we're going to have a yarn about moving forward here is some of the ways that we may be able to reflect on our social emotional well-being, and what are some of the things that we can do to better protect that moving forward, given the event that has occurred with the referendum. So what are some of the positives that we can hang on to and build upon post-referendum? Because as difficult as it has been to find them, they definitely were there, and I think it's important that we reflect on those. So first and foremost, we know that over 6.2 million Australians voted yes in the referendum. For me as a father of 3 Gomeroi children, that makes me feel quite good that I have over 6 million Australians who were mindful and thoughtful about the future of my children. That's something that I want to be able to build on. So for me, I'm reflecting on how do I bolster that support? How do we build on 6 million? And how do we bolster the voice of that 6 million as we move forward so that we can get some more positive outcomes for our next generation, for our children? We also know that in particular areas, there was yes votes. So for instance, the ACT, where a lot of our federal business occurs, it was a yes decision within that jurisdiction. So I think there's some positives that we can take from that in terms of where federal decisions are being based, there's support for us to have this united voice in terms of our affairs as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people moving forward. So again, it's a matter of us reflecting on how do we use that support that is there in a way that increases the likelihood or the chances that we will get positive outcomes moving forward. So there's some of the questions that I've been rattling around my head, and some of the questions that I think we can all start looking at in terms of how do I use the positives that came out of the referendum, the simple ones that were available in stats, and I'm sure there was many more, to move forward. So where can we build? Well, some of the areas that I feel that we can do more work in building in a positive direction moving forward is around things like working our own ways And in the health and mental health spheres, I think that is becoming more and more social emotional wellbeing focused and ensuring that others, so non-Indigenous peoples that we may be working with, government departments, funding bodies, etc., have an increased awareness of what that means to work from a social emotional wellbeing perspective. And our role within that might be, how do I educate, or how do I advocate, or how do I work in and evaluate those ways to garner that support? I think we can do a better job, and we can probably always be working at this in terms of how do we build better partnerships and support each other better and practice lateral kindness. If we want to move away from lateral violence, we have to learn how to practice lateral kindness. And that really is about us appreciating each other more, sharing more love with each other, and practicing acceptance first and foremost, particularly with events like the referendum and the vote situations that have come out of that. I think we can do a lot of work in the space of promoting and supporting personal, but also community capacity building in a whole realm of spaces that will give us a better opportunity to have a voice at a whole bunch of tables. So for example, I don't care much for my psychology registration as such from a practitioner perspective. I think a lot of the ways that psychology work actually go against our ways of knowing, being, and doing, and I've always been very vocal about that. But what my education, so what my psychology degree and then what my PhD has allowed me to have, is quite a prominent voice to people in positions of authority, influence, and power. And I think that is a great thing to have come out of undertaking studies that don't necessarily fit that great with my ways of understanding the world and my place within it. So I'm constantly looking at what is the positives through what I've had the opportunity to receive, and how can I use those in a way to better be able to give back. And for me, having those pieces of paper has allowed me to have an opportunity at a whole bunch of different tables where I get to be an influence. I have to accept I have no control, but I definitely get to be an influence in many of the conversations to do with our social and emotional well-being. And I think that the more we can build up more people within our communities in a whole bunch of sectors, it doesn't have to be social emotional well-being related. It can be education based. It could be astrophysics. I think it all counts as long as it gives us a seat at the table and we are actioning our influence, but at the same time accepting we don't necessarily have control over outcomes. Simply having a voice is an improvement on not being at the table at all. So that goes into growing our next leaders. You know, I really think we need to be focused on how do we build strong, resilient leaders into the future. And that really does rely on us, in my generation and above, to be looking at how do we practice lateral kindness to those that are coming through, rather than getting stuck in the facets of lateral violence, which have been bred into many of us because of the ways that individualist systems actually work, but they're not our ways. How do we negate the lateral violence? How do we expand the lateral kindness so that our next generation actually have the greatest opportunities to achieve the things that are going to allow us collectively to move forward in a positive direction? And most importantly, I think what we need to do, and this comes back to individuals, but also is a responsibility of organisations, is we need to dedicate time to self-care. At an individual level, the most important ingredient with that is allowing ourselves the time for self-care. At an organisational level, the most important ingredient within that is dedicating time for employees to actually self-care. So I think there's multiple levels there where we all, both at an individual and a family level, get to play our part. So I'm going to run through a few different ways of our ways of working that I think can be of benefit. So firstly, I think that if we're going to talk about working our ways and how that can be of benefit, that we need to ensure that we're working from those more holistic perspectives, such as social and emotional well-being. So what you can see in front of you there is just two different depictions of holistic ways of thinking, doing, knowing, and how that relates to the self as a connected being. I don't have enough time in this presentation to really go through the ins and outs of these models. So I'm just going to give a really quick overview of what a social emotional wellbeing model is trying to explain. So in essence, what social emotional wellbeing is trying to depict is that as a being, I am a complete being with many different facets that are important to my overall existence, well-being, sense of identity, etc. And a lot of that is based on connections that may not necessarily be within the self. So they may be external. So yes, well, facets of my physical health and mental health are part of me personally, and there's biological facets to that. And we have to acknowledge and accept those things. So all those stuff in biomedicine is real. We also know that a lot of our well-being is very much contingent on the well-being of those things we're connected to, like our families, like our communities, like our law and our culture. And we know that there's many things that happen out within those connections that will have an impact back on our well-being. So if we consider the recent referendum, for instance, if you look within these models, you'll see that it says experience and expressions on one of them. On the other one, it says notions of positive and negative law. One of those determinants that exists within that wheel is political determinants. And the whole referendum was a political determinant that has had an impact on the overall well-being of us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We can't escape that. We know it's there, and we know it can have either a positive or negative influence at any time, depending on what's going on within those discussions. So I think the more aware of it we are, the more likely we are to be able to hold on to what is a part of what I control and what is out of my control. So sometimes those political determinations are out of our control. Again, I'll go back to that notion of we can have influence, but we don't necessarily have control of outcomes. So we tried to have a strong influence in a particular direction within that political event, but we didn't necessarily have control over the outcome. Definitely not as individuals or as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a whole, to be honest. Because at the end of the day, we're only less than 4% of the overall population. So the entire outcome was largely out of our control. We had an opportunity for great influence, and I think that influence was portrayed in a very strong manner by a lot of people, and it garnered us the support of over 6 million people. But we do need to be aware that our overall well-being can be impacted by many factors that are out of our control. So the trick for me has always been to look at what is within my control. Simply 3 things. What is it that I say, think, and do on a daily basis, and how do I activate those in a positive way? I apply the exact same rationale to my role as a director within Black Dog, or my role as the owner and CEO of Sober Beverages. What is it that I can say, think, and do each and every day in a positive way that will have a strong influence over the outcomes in those situations, and accepting that certain things I just don't have control over. So how do I try and maintain positivity within those 3 simple things that I have any control? What I say, what I think, and what I do within the areas that I choose to represent and to be present. So what I do is I actually reflect on all the positive elements as such that are listed in that green map there. So you can see simple things like respect, responsibilities, practicing reciprocity, practicing acceptance, maintaining connections and understanding the interconnectedness that exists between everything I'm connected to and everything that those connections are connected to, and how it all fits together in one big puzzle. So understanding that all the decisions and all the actions that I make through what I say, think, and do really do have at some level an impact out onto everything. And that's the way that we've always processed as mob. And I think that we can continue to move in that direction, particularly in the ways that we work within organisations. Now, this isn't normal for organisations within Australia because they work from a position of individualism, not collectivism, which goes against a lot of these notions of working in unison and partnership with each other for a greater benefit. So here we have a bit of a map of how I try and ensure that I'm maintaining the fuel, maintaining the fire, giving myself motivation to undertake the things that I choose to do in my daily life and ensure that they are of benefit beyond myself. And it's also something that I heavily encourage with all the teams that I work with, be that through consultancy I do, be it through my staff that work at Sober Beverages, or through my role as Director of First Nation Strategy and Partnerships at Black Dog Institute. And I think the first part is to reflect on our connections. So with those last circles, those tires, wheels, whatever you want to reflect them on that I had in that slide previous, they start to explore connections. What I'd suggest to people is to unpack for yourself, what are the connections that are important to you and your well-being? I think that does two things. One, it allows us to really understand what is important in our lives, to our well-being, to our positive sense of self, so that we can look at where do we best need to be focusing our attention and our energy. What it secondly does is it gives us an awareness of the roles and the responsibilities that we hold to those connections. By understanding those roles and responsibilities, we can start unpacking what are the resources or the opportunities that I need in order to fulfill those responsibilities. Being able to fulfill responsibilities to our connections, particularly those ones that are of high importance to us, gives us a really strong sense of purpose and worth, strong sense of grounding and meaning within our lives. And all those fuel a good sense of well living and can lead us into thriving. So I think this is an easy way to map out how we can move forward in a positive direction. So I think we can all take the opportunity to reflect on what has gone on throughout the referendum and go, okay, what is actually important to me? What are my connections? What is it that I can say, think, and do that can have a positive influence moving forward through being able to fulfill my roles and responsibilities that will give me that strong sense of purpose, worth, grounding, and meaning that will fuel me on to having well living and thriving, not just individually, but collectively. So Gabaninda, thank you everybody for allowing me the opportunity to have a yarn with you all. And I hope there was something of benefit there for everybody. Yalu.
Hello everybody, Thomas Mayo here. Pleased to join you at this webinar. Just want to thank Gayaa Dhuwi for the invitation to speak to you all. I'm just going to talk about the referendum, what we saw as far as the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through that period, and what it means given the result, the failure of Australia to grapple with its past and to move forward in a way that a great majority of Indigenous people supported, as we saw in the results. And also talk about then, about how I think we can stay strong, we can continue to build on the positives that came out of the referendum. And I think one of those great positives was that over 6 million people voted yes, around 40% of Australians. And I'll talk about that as well. A little bit about myself first. For those that might not know about me, I am a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander man. I grew up here in Darwin on Larrakia country, and for much of my working life, 16 years, from when I was 17, I was a wharf labourer, doing labouring work and driving cranes and forklifts and all that sort of thing. Became an official of the Union, the Maritime Union of Australia, and that's what I continue to be, an elected official of the MUA, or the Maritime Union. But I became involved in our own people's advocacy quite some time ago. That was always supported by the union movement, by my union. The union movement in this country has been really important to advancing our rights as Indigenous peoples. There's been a lot of solidarity over a very long period of time, and back when not many other organisations were really supporting our struggle. And so it's something that made me proud to be a Wharfian, proud to be a union member and now a union official. But I became more involved in our people's advocacy, using what I'd learnt on the wharf, as in organising, activism, understanding, building power, those types of things to be able to get better results for what your people collectively are going for. I went to the dialogue in Darwin that led to the making of the Uluru Statement, was elected. Uncle Jakar Kit, one of our great leaders who sadly passed on a few years ago, nominated me to go to Uluru, elected from the dialogue. And when we made the Uluru Statement from the heart, I committed myself to advocating for it, and that's what I did for 6 years, again with the support of the union, full-time, just fighting for the opportunity for Australians to answer that question. Did everything I could to try and help us succeed, but we failed, sadly. And I think it's important to consider why we failed. I don't think we failed because the sentiment of the Australian people are against us. I think the referendum went down because people were confused and made to fear what a voice would mean to them personally by a very dishonest no campaign, and it was effective to their credit, but it was no less immoral the way that they did it. We saw through that campaign racism increase exponentially as one of the tactics that the No campaign used, and it was designed to intimidate us, Indigenous people that were advocating for it. There was a army of trolls that were mobilised on social media that would be searching for anything positive that was said about the referendum to try and take the wind out of our sails and to deter us from speaking up. A bit of an irony there, we were seeking a voice, and before we could even have a vote, they were seeking to silence that voice, as happened so many times throughout the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander struggle. I, as a leader, saw the worst of it, myself and others like Professor Marcia Langton, and we saw how the media turned the racism that we were copying into something that was less, while any mention of what we were going through, what we were seeing perpetrated against us was used or weaponized against us because they understood that when the debate became about if people were racist or not, that deterred people from wanting to support such a reform. And so I wrote about it in the Saturday paper just before Christmas, but it was as if we were put on trial. We who had suffered the crimes for so long were put on trial as if we were guilty of something ourselves, as if we were, as if we had something to answer for, when really it was the rest of the country had the opportunity to answer for what has happened and what continues to affect us today. This was somewhat a very sad chapter in the push for recognition and for justice, but I just want to bring some light to the positive sides of what happened, in that when we consider that we have tried such things many times before, certainly not a referendum, but statements and petitions and and efforts to see legislation. We have seen these hopeful moments, and we have seen them fail when the powers that be have walked away or used us as a political opportunity instead of making progress. But every time we have had those moments throughout our history, we have turned those moments into another stepping block towards where we need to go. And I think 2023 was one of those stepping blocks, and I'll explain why. I think that we worked hard, and we stood up against the racism, and we stood up against the unfairness that was going on through the campaign. We had many non-Indigenous people that had never been a part of a political campaign ever before in their lives sign up as volunteers. I met quite a few of them when we went door knocking. I travelled the country and went door knocking with many different groups of Yes supporters, and they were there with their children, and door knocking for the first time in their lives. One of the interesting pieces of information that I'll share with you was that before the referendum, at the beginning of 2023, there was polling done to measure how well people understood the issues that Indigenous people face with housing and the justice system and various things, and it was quite a low number. I think it was only around 15% said that they were confident in their knowledge. The week of the referendum, we saw that same poll done, and the numbers were close to 50%, similar numbers to what we saw as in the yes vote in the referendum. And so what we did through the referendum campaign, and I always knew this, I'd known this for a long time, but the referendum campaign itself would be a very extensive and the greatest truth-telling that we will have done so far in the struggle, to force all Australians to consider what the issue is and if they would support a particular reform. Brought that conversation to their kitchen tables, many for the first time in their lives discussing Indigenous issues. And yes, the misinformation got through, and yes, some have the wrong idea about these things, but we shifted a lot of people to vote yes. We shifted a lot of people to understand where they didn't before, and to reckon with their past and express that through writing yes at the ballot box. I think all of the people that voted yes are solid supporters. They are people that have made a conscious decision for change, whereas I think that the people that voted no, sure, some of them are absolutely entrenched in their position, and a lot of them have racism and darkness in their heart. But I think given that they were misinformed, that they were made to fear something that was untrue, I think a lot of the no voters are not necessarily never going to come over and support justice for Indigenous people. I don't think that all of them have this ignorance or dislike of Indigenous people, and I think in some ways that gives us hope that we have built a large base of supporters, and I think that we cannot give up on the fight, and that's really, I think, the concluding remarks that I need to make. As I said, we've tried many things before, our elders before our time, and they never gave up. Sure, sometimes we need to look after ourselves and our mental health and have a break. We all manage these things differently, and that's important for us to look after ourselves and our family and continue to check in with each other. And if you're non-Indigenous, check in with people, with your Indigenous brothers and sisters, and continue to carry that load with us to see permanent change in this country and justice delivered to our people. We understand that we must continue to fight. To do anything else is impossible, because we are talking about our family, we're talking about our communities, and I'm talking from the perspective of a First Nations person. I will never give up, because I know that it's not only about improving this country, but most importantly, it's about my friends and family and my communities, and that's why we can never give up. I'm currently working on a book. I wrote the Voice to Parliament handbook that I think helped us in the referendum campaign to educate a lot of people. It sold over 100,000 copies throughout that campaign. Much of the royalties to that are going to the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. But now I wrote that with Kerry O'Brien, but at the moment I'm working on a book that is, I'm just authoring on my own, that will guide hopefully the 6 million people that voted yes and the no voters that were confused to continue to walk with us. So to conclude, I just want to encourage you all with the work that you're doing, wish you the best. I admire the work that you're doing, especially in the space of mental health and the frontline services to our people and our communities. It's so important. 2023 was a bit of a bump in the road. As I said, it is a step towards where we need to go, but never give up. Continue to fight for justice. It always was and it always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tanja Hirvonen. I'm Jaro and Bunaba and a clinical psychologist and also a board director for the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association. Thank you for having me today to talk about self-care, and I hope you get something out of this conversation. I'm prefacing this conversation on self-care, or how to look after yourself if you're First Nations and you work in the sectors of health and well-being. We're living in a wonderful world with beauty, opportunity, you know, our beautiful seasons, and, you know, we've had some beautiful time just over the Christmas. We've got songlines and stories of how the world was created. We've got ways of living and knowledge systems that span for more than 60,000 years. With a full stop on that, we are also reminded almost daily that it is also a world that has difficulties and challenges. It is a world that is not just and has difficulty with equity. So much so, like the World Justice Project data suggests that discrimination is widespread and getting worse all around the world. So this is a global issue. You know, we're here to talk about self-care in the face of the referendum. So referendum exposed, or look, racism was always around. Racism has always been here, and there's been anti-racism efforts. However, racism was laid bare in the past year with the efforts of the referendum. It was almost that you couldn't go on into any media platform and see racism at its core. Also, the experiences of racism had increased significantly. So much so that an opinion piece by the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, Chin Tan, asserted that the next urgent national priority for Australia is tackling racism. That opinion piece was written in October 2023, so only 4 months ago. Again, that was from the Australian Human Rights, that racism, we do have a long way to go. Many First Nation psychologists during the last year, or anyone working in health and well-being, reported a surge in work and working with those who had had experiences of racism, had elevated stress and anxiety, and were feeling the sadness and despair. And there were many of us working with those who were facing structural racism. For First Nations health and wellbeing workforce, having a degree, a certification or title does not protect you from racism, protect you from seeing racism, experiencing racism, and working in and around racism. There are also the demands for those First Nations health and wellbeing professionals, as there's so few of you around, and the needs are high. Therefore, you get shoulder tapped a lot more. You might be responding to a lot more requests, particularly in the past year. And I want to add some more layers on that. This is also on the backdrop of ongoing discrimination. This is also with the backdrop of the messaging in society that sometimes there's been special treatment to acquire a job, degree, or certificate, that you may have had special treatment, you may have, received the degree more easily than others. And also there's another, another concern that, if you're helping, getting this degree, you should be honestly always helping your own. And you can help your own for free or help your own at your own time and cost. You should just be able to do it, notwithstanding that you have bills in a family that you may be needing to support. On top of that, there's also that messaging we, sometimes internalize because of society, that you need to work extra hard to prove yourself just to sit at the same table as others. So for First Nation health and wellbeing workforce, there are extra layers other than just, the general high workload or the general complexity of the work or the general hours. There's all those other layers that can also exhaust First Nation health and wellbeing professionals or the workforce. Hearing that and working in these spaces reinforces why we need to think carefully about what we need to do to practice self-care and being more intentional about self-care. And it's absolutely vital to think carefully about how we look after ourselves and each other. So let's go to self-care. What does it mean to look after yourself and your family and your community? First of all, it's about making a commitment that you practice self-care. There was a time when people gave so much of themselves that even your last shirt off your back, the last meal that you have. And look, again, no judgment, but when that happens or when that occurs, and people could still do that, and then again, no judgment. But when you've got nothing left to give and you've got nothing left of yourself, and there is a thing called burnout and emotional exhaustion, what happens to you, what happens to your family and your community. So again, as another First Nation wellbeing worker, anyone that has ever had anything to do with me or worked around me knows that I promote self-care as much as I can, not only in talking and verbally, but also practicing what we preach. So making sure that the colleagues that we have around us are looking after themselves as well. Look, self-care can have different meanings for different people in different professions. Generally, it's about treating yourself with the care that you need to ensure that you're able to cope with the events in your life, because you're human, things are going to happen with you, alongside making sure that you're able to live the life that you want to live with work that you want to do or the family life that you want to have. The word self-care can be problematic, like it does appear to be an individualistic term and not from a collectivist approach. I don't think we've landed just yet what an equivalent word could be. So I will continue to use the word self-care. But there are things that we do at an individual level that's very, very important. So that's like the exercise, the sleep, the diet, all the things that you need to do individually, that you can do individually to look after you, and also how you can share that with your family. But there's also other activities that are important to us for us to gather together, like at the family, at the community level. We need times for ourselves, but we also need time to reconnect and strengthen our place in our families and communities. There are also layers of self-care, different layers of self-care. So you got the physical, we talked about that diet, exercise, the social relationships, like who do we have in our lives that are fulfilling or give us love or we can share love with. There's the well-being element of self-care. What are we doing to manage our well-being? What fills our bucket? The spirituality, and the emotional level of or aspect of self-care. Some other considerations, as mentioned earlier, may involve family, community, and must always try and include culture. I like to think of self-care that we treat self-care as a relationship that we have with ourselves and others. Like we would with a relationship, the checking in, the checkpoints to make sure that things are going well, that we are continually growing that relationship. So we're growing the self-care, not weakening. Like, what are the things that would add value, not take away? What are the boundaries that are in place that support, well, self-care and well-being? That's that give and take. Okay, I might have to work extra this week, but what can I do differently next week? What's the give and take here? There's no good also being in bed thinking about all the things that we need to do. The ups and downs, there are going to be ups and downs with self-care, as there is in relationships, and what can we do to manage that, and what are the things that we have in place to manage those those barriers. The other key to this is the honesty. So honesty is the key. Just as we need to be honest in relationships with others and ourselves, being really honest with ourselves, honesty about what we are doing around self-care and how we're managing self-care, and how we might need to be doing things, and being honest with others and we need to meet our needs. Self-care is also about connection, about relationality. So connecting with those that you trust to support and care for you and others. Joining community groups or exercise groups or social groups that have similar values, but also justice areas and social justice areas that you are aligned with. So you are also being able to give back in some way. As mentioned earlier, family. Going back to social emotional well-being, the Graham G model, 2014, we've got Dr. Graham G, Dr. Clinton Shultz, Professor Pat Dudgeon, Kerry Kelly, Amanda Hart, that social emotional well-being framework. Looking at all of those components of social emotional well-being and knowing that they also absolutely factor in for yourselves. But just on top of, you have permission to feel what you want to feel, how you want to feel it. Strong social emotional well-being maintains our well-being through connections to body, mind, emotion, spirituality, land, community, families, and culture. So that framework certainly is a solid framework for retaining wellness. Thank you.